Hello everyone, and welcome to the next installment of the Jane Eyre adaptation comparison. Today we're going to discuss the scene in chapter 27 of Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, in which Jane decides that she has to leave, and Rochester tries to convince her to stay. This is a long video. I did my best to trim it down, but it's a lengthy scene with a lot of dialogue that needs attention. If you're just interested in comparing the adaptations, here's a timestamp for when I finally finish the summary and discussion and get to the adaptations. Obviously, since we're this far into the book, this video contains spoilers for Jane Eyre, and I should probably mention that it's going to touch on some slightly mature content. Slightly. Okay, let's dive in here. After having her wedding interrupted and meeting Rochester's insane wife Bertha, Jane retreats to her bedroom. She symbolically changes out of her bridal gown back into the somber, simple clothes she's been wearing, which Rochester intended her never to put on again. This is where we left her last time, contemplating her dead hopes and destroyed confidence. She acknowledges that she'll have to leave Thornfield and Rochester, and suspects he won't even want to see her again. Chapter 26 ends with a prayer as Jane is overwhelmed by a torrent of emotions, which is perfectly understandable. Chapter 27 picks up a few hours later as Jane wrestles with her resolution to leave Rochester so quickly and rush into who knows what kind of situation. Lack of nourishment makes her a little delirious, so she opens her locked door to go downstairs. In her weak state, she stumbles over something and is caught by Rochester, who's been sitting outside her room in agony for hours. He expected, even wanted her to make a scene, but he's shocked to find that she hasn't cried at all. He says he never meant to wound her and asks if she'll ever forgive him. Responding to his sincerity, Jane forgives him immediately, but doesn't tell him so. He begs Jane for a rebuke, some kind of response, but she's too weak, so he carries her downstairs and gets her some food and wine. She asked for water, but okay. As she's recovering, her mind is divided in two, and she thinks about how she'd rather die than go through the pain of tearing herself away from him. Rochester tries to kiss her, and she turns away. Much as she may want it, she won't accept the embrace of a married man. He's upset and tries to guess what she's thinking. He's partly right. Jane states that Adele must have a new governess, and Rochester says, of course! Adele will go to school as planned, and will leave this place. It's at this point that he mentions his other property, Ferndean Manor, and says that he would have put Bertha there where she would be out of the way, except he was concerned that it would be too damp and unhealthy for her. He may not have loved her, but he had compassion for her and refused to endanger her life in order to gain his own freedom. That's in addition to his refusal to put her in an asylum where she might be abused or neglected. Rochester's no saint, but he's not a villain either. As Rochester's explaining that he'll let Bertha and Grace Poole have free rein at Thornfield, he speaks flippantly of his wife, and Jane censures him, saying it's cruel, she cannot help being mad. He responds to that with one of the most earnest speeches he makes in the whole book, saying, "It's not because she is mad I hate her. If you were mad, do you think I should hate you?" Jane answers, "I do indeed, sir." And he says, "Then you are mistaken, and you know nothing about me, and nothing about the sort of love of which I am capable. Every atom of your flesh is as dear to me as my own. In pain and sickness it would still be dear. Your mind is my treasure, and if it were broken, it would be my treasure still. If you raved, my arms should confine you, and not a strait waistcoat. Your grasp, even in fury, would have a charm for me. If you flew at me as wildly as that woman did this morning, I should receive you in an embrace, at least as fond as it would be restrictive. I should not shrink from you with disgust as I did from her. In your quiet moments you should have no watcher and no nurse but me, and I could hang over you with untiring tenderness, though you gave me no smile in return, and never weary of gazing into your eyes, though they had no longer a ray of recognition for me." I've seen people speculate about this promise, wondering if he'd really keep it if Jane underwent a debilitating change. I believe he does mean it. If Jane went mad or got sick, she would still be the woman he loved. He never loved Bertha. wanted her, was attracted to her, sure, but that's not the same thing. It is possible that he could say all this and mean it, but in reality, he wouldn't be able to stand it. That happens. People make the in sickness and in health vow with the best of intentions, but the pain and sadness of, say, watching a loved one go through dementia, which removes your memory and changes your personality, can be too much. So I believe Rochester means what he says here. Up to this point, he hasn't exactly exhibited a soft, patient, nurturing side, but being with Jane changes him for the better. We've seen that, and I think he would do anything for her. However, I don't know if he would have the fortitude to bear it if she were so changed and so unresponsive to him. I don't think that he would desert her, but I think that he would be really depressed, to put it mildly. This is all hypothetical, of course. Anyway, Rochester suddenly says, "Why am I talking about this? I have a plan, I have a place we can go to, and we're leaving tomorrow." Jane starts saying Adele should go with him to keep him company, and he's irritated by her apparent lack of understanding. And then he gets it. He says, calmly, "Now for the hitch in Jane's character," a line which implies to me that deep down, he knew this roadblock was coming. Now let me take a few seconds to address a paragraph that I think could be misunderstood. Rochester says that if she won't listen to reason, he'll try violence. Now I can hear all of the 21st century alarm bells going off, but I don't think he's saying, "Do what I want, or I'm gonna beat you into submission." In times past, the word violence was used sometimes in ways we don't use it now to emphasize romantic passion. For example, in Pride and Prejudice you have the line, "And now nothing remains for me but to assure you in the most animated language of the violence of my affections." Or in It's a Wonderful Life, "He's making violent love to me, mother." The word violence in that context is synonymous with ardor, vehemence, fervor, and overall lack or loss of control because of intense desire. So what does Rochester mean? Well, the way I see it, he's saying that if talking won't work, he will resort to physical measures to remind her that they need to be together. Basically, I'm gonna kiss the heck out of you to persuade you that you can't just give me the cold shoulder. Maybe he's thinking, if I seduce her, or compromise her, or ruin her, however you want to put it, she'll have to go away with me. But I don't think he wants her against her will. Intimacy with Jane as an unwilling or detached participant would not appeal to him. I'm guessing. All that to say, I don't personally think he's talking about beating her or raping her. Perhaps you don't read it that way. Maybe I'm being lenient. It does go on to say that the present, the passing second of time, was all I had in which to control and restrain him. A movement of repulsion, flight, fear would have sealed my doom and his. Now that makes it sound like maybe he was going to force himself on her, but Jane's reaction, "I was not afraid, not in the least," doesn't indicate that she felt she was in that kind of danger. And then Jane begins to cry, on purpose, to get him under control, which is an amusing reminder that she is still able to hold her own and even get the upper hand with him. None of the adaptations include this little bit of manipulation. It's a clever tactic. He assures her that he's not angry and begs her to stop, because men get uncomfortable when women cry. So she calms down, and instantly he tries to take her in his arms, but she rebuffs him. He takes that as a sign that she doesn't love him. Perhaps she never did love him and just wanted his position, wanted to be Mrs. Rochester and have the house and all that. Jane is moved to say, "I do love you, more than ever, but I must not show or indulge the feeling, and this is the last time I must express it." They go back and forth a bit, and he states that he plans to take her to a villa in the south of France, where, since he has no wife, she'll be Mrs. Rochester, and he assures her he'd never make her his mistress. To that, Jane replies that his wife is living, as he acknowledged this morning. Therefore, if she were to live with him, a married man, she would be his mistress, and there's no other way to put it. He gets all worked up again, and Jane is so concerned that she begs God for help. Suddenly, Rochester says, You know what? You need to hear the full story of Bertha Mason Rochester. So he gives her an expanded version of the Bertha backstory that we got in the previous chapter. Edward Rochester was the younger son. His greedy father wanted to keep his large property together by leaving it to the elder son, but he wanted Edward to have money too, so he and his son cooked up a scheme to get Edward a rich wife. They found her in the daughter of Mason of the West Indies, a wealthy merchant and acquaintance who was offering a dowry of £30,000. Edward was sent to Jamaica to marry her. According to him, my father said nothing about her money, but he told me Miss Mason was the boast of Spanish Town for her beauty, and this was no lie. I found her a fine woman, in the style of Blanche Ingram, tall, dark, majestic. They showed her to me in parties, splendidly dressed. I seldom saw her alone, and had very little private conversation with her. I was dazzled, stimulated, my senses were excited, and being ignorant, raw, and inexperienced, I thought I loved her. A marriage was achieved almost before I knew where I was. I never loved, I never esteemed, I did not even know her. He also wasn't told that she was 5 years older than him, and by the way, by my calculation, he was about 22 at the time of this marriage, since he says he's 26 when they've been married for 4 years. He thinks Bertha's mother is dead, but after the honeymoon, he finds out she's been locked away in a lunatic asylum, and according to him, Bertha's younger brother is insane as well, and her elder brother, Richard, who we've met a couple times, is bound to go the same way. Rochester says, my father and my brother Roland knew all this, but they thought only of the £30,000 and joined in the plot against me. These were vile discoveries, but except for the treachery of concealment, I should have made them no subject of reproach to my wife. Even when I found her nature wholly alien to mine, her tastes obnoxious to me, her cast of mind common, low, narrow, and singularly incapable of being led to anything higher, expanded to anything larger, when I found that I could not pass a single evening nor a single hour of the day with her in comfort, that kindly conversation could not be sustained between us, because whatever topic I started immediately received from her a turn at once coarse and trite, perverse and imbecile, when I perceived that I should never have a quiet or settled household, because no servant would bear the continued outbreaks of her violent and unreasonable temper, or the vexations of her absurd, contradictory, exacting orders. Even then I restrained myself. I eschewed upbraiding, I curtailed remonstrance. I tried to devour my repentance and disgust in secret. I repressed the deep antipathy I felt. He doesn't go into explicit detail for Jane's sake, but he does allude to the increasingly abominable behavior, saying that for 4 years Bertha Mason, the true daughter of an infamous mother, dragged me through all the hideous and degrading agonies which must attend a man bound to a wife at once intemperate and unchaste. By that point, his father and his brother are both dead, so he's rich anyway, but he's still stuck with Bertha. A nature the most gross, impure, depraved I ever saw was associated with mine, and called by the law and by society a part of me, and I could not rid myself of it by any legal proceedings, for the doctors now discovered that my wife was mad. Her excesses had prematurely developed the germs of insanity. That addresses a question that a lot of readers have asked: why didn't he just divorce her? Aside from the fact that divorce was not nearly as prevalent and much more shameful back then than it is today, Victorian marriage law, among other things, stated that you could not divorce someone on the grounds of insanity. As a side note, he says that doctors had examined her and determined she was mad, so there's probably a medical record somewhere declaring it. It wasn't just Rochester's vindictive diagnosis, as I have seen some people claim. And frankly, that's an accusation that doesn't make sense to me, because if he wanted to be rid of her, he didn't love her, he wanted to move on with somebody else, but she wasn't legally declared insane, then he could have divorced her. So why would he say that? Rochester feels himself trapped. He describes waking one night to Bertha screaming and cursing at him. He is so desperate that he considers shooting himself to escape from this living hell. Then he resolves instead to return to England, to confine her with due attendance and precautions at Thornfield, and then himself flee to the continent where no one knows about his marriage or his tarnished reputation. He talks about making the journey and finding a suitable attendant, how Grace Poole and the local doctor are the only people in the know, and how he went looking for a good and intelligent woman whom he could love. When Jane points out that he couldn't marry, he says, "I had determined and was convinced that I could and ought. It was not my original intention to deceive as I have deceived you. I meant to tell my tale plainly and make my proposals openly, and it appeared to me so absolutely rational that I should be considered free to love and be loved. I never doubted some woman might be found willing and able to understand my case and accept me in spite of the curse with which I was burdened." Rochester traveled around for 10 years, failing to find the right person and distracting himself with dissipation. He mentions the 3 mistresses he had. Jane doesn't really want to hear about that, and Rochester's not proud of it either. He speaks of them as inferiors by nature and by position. Privately, Jane thinks, if I were so far to forget myself and all the teaching that had ever been instilled into me, as under any pretext, with any justification, through any temptation, to become the successor of these poor girls, he would one day regard me with the same feeling which now in his mind desecrated their memory. He then recalls the night they met and recounts the history of their relationship from his perspective. But Jane doesn't want to hear this, because it makes what she has to do that much more difficult. Rochester agrees he was wrong to deceive her. He would have told her the truth sooner, but he was afraid that she'd be stubborn and desert him. Which is probably absolutely correct. Having reached the end of his explanation, Rochester makes a promise of fidelity and asks for the same in return. And this is it. Through the whole scene, they've been dancing around this issue, but they can't avoid it any longer. This is the crisis that Jane has been dreading. Rochester is murmuring sweet romantic phrases and embracing her and kissing her and saying, "Do you really mean to go one way in the world and let me go another?" while she's mentally struggling to resist the temptation to give in. It comes down to this fundamental disagreement. Rochester says, "It would not be wicked to love me," and Jane says, "It would to obey you." He changes his tactic. What'll become of him when she's gone? She's condemning him to a life of misery and loneliness, or worse. What'll he do? Jane says, "Do as I do. Trust in God and yourself. Believe in heaven. Hope to meet again there." Rochester eventually counters with this: "Is it better to drive a fellow creature to despair than to transgress a mere human law, no man being injured by the breach? For you have neither relatives nor acquaintances whom you need fear to offend by living with me." This was true. And while he spoke, my very conscience and reason turned traitors against me and charged me with crime in resisting him. They spoke almost as loud as feeling, and that clamored wildly. "Oh, comply," it said. "Think of his misery, think of his danger. Look at his state when left alone. Remember his headlong nature, consider the recklessness following on despair. Soothe him, save him, love him. Tell him you love him and will be his. Who in the world cares for you, or who will be injured by what you do?" Still indomitable was the reply. "I care for myself. The more solitary, the more friendless, the more unsustained I am, the more I will respect myself. I will keep the law given by God, sanctioned by man. I will hold to the principles received by me when I was sane and not mad, as I am now. Laws and principles are not for the times when there is no temptation. They are for such moments as this, when body and soul rise in mutiny against their rigor. Stringent are they, inviolate they shall be. If at my individual convenience I might break them, what would be their worth? They have a worth, so I have always believed, and if I cannot believe it now, it is because I am insane, quite insane, with my veins running fire and my heart beating faster than I can count its throbs. Preconceived opinions, foregone determinations, are all I have at this hour to stand by. There I plant my foot." Boom! I love her for this. This is a meaningful moment for her character, and on a personal level, it speaks to me. There was a point in my teens when I suddenly realized that, in my own way, of course, I related to Jane's struggle here, the inner battle between her desire for love and her moral convictions. This internal monologue where she steels herself to do not what she wants, but what she believes is right and what she always promised to do was encouraging and inspiring to me at that time, and I've never forgotten that. Though she doesn't say all of this to him, he recognizes, by looking in her eyes, that she has made an unshakable resolution, and he's incensed. He grabs her arm and waist in what she describes as a painful grip. He gives one final frustrated speech, acknowledging that her will and her moral fiber are too strong for him. Never was anything at once so frail and so indomitable. A mere reed she feels in my hand. I could bend her with my finger and thumb, and what good would it do if I bent, if I uptore, if I crushed her? And it is you, spirit, with will and energy and virtue and purity that I want, not alone your brittle frame. Of yourself you could come with soft flight and nestle against my heart, if you would. Seized against your will, you will elude the grasp like an essence. You will vanish ere I inhale your fragrance. He lets her go in despair, and finding this harder to resist than his anger, she turns to leave. There are a few incredulous rounds of, "Are you really going?" before he throws himself down on the sofa. At the sound of his heartache, Jane does turn back, giving him a final caress and asking God's blessing on him. Unsurprisingly, this gives him renewed hope, and he reaches for her, but she gets away. At this point in my copy there's an asterisk, but I'm going to go a couple pages further because the adaptations often condense all this into one scene. Back in her bedroom, Jane sleeps and dreams of the light she saw when she was in the Red Room at Gateshead years ago, but now it's taken a form telling her to flee temptation. At dawn, she packs a few belongings and her 20 shillings and heads out. She does pause outside Rochester's door. She hears him in there, pacing and sighing. She could go in there and be happy, and the thought of how desperate he'll be when she's gone further tempts her to open his door, but no, she leaves. So that was the summary. It's taken me 2 hours to film that. This is where I would usually make some additional comments, but I guess I touched all the bases in the summary. I'll just add 2 things. Number 1, I am aware that for some people, this scene doesn't click. Your attitude might be, "What's the problem, Jane? If you want to be with him, just do it. Go live with him. No one will know the difference, and you'll be happy." If that's your response, well, I don't know that there's anything I can say to make you more sympathetic to her dilemma. You have to understand the historical and social context, as well as the religious motivation. Her refusal to go away and live with Rochester is about maintaining her self-respect, but it's also about upholding her moral convictions. If that doesn't compute... Number 2, I think it says a lot about Rochester that even when he felt angry, bitter, and betrayed, he still whisked Bertha away to the safest place possible, and I don't think he ever tried to harm her. Okay, finally, let's see how everybody adapted this scene. All 9 versions that I've been looking at in this comparison series have this scene, but they've all done it differently, of course. Since the 1934 version rolled the engagement period, the Bertha reveal, Rochester's explanation, and Jane's exit into one quick-moving sequence, I've had to chop it up a couple times. Obviously, it flows better left as is, though it's still far off from the book. Last time, I cut it off as the vicar was leaving following Rochester's explanation about the annulment papers. Jane finally gets to ask why he didn't tell her about Bertha, and he explains that he loved her and wanted to spare her. So if the annulment had gone through in time, she might not have known anything about his marriage. Rochester here isn't really guilty of trying to commit bigamy, he's more a victim of bad timing. His motive wasn't purely selfless, though. He also was afraid of losing his only happiness. He cites that specialists have found Bertha's madness incurable, so he did what he could and kept her at home. He then repeats his plea for forgiveness, but before Jane can respond, and it's unclear what she'll say, they are interrupted by a scream. Mrs. Fairfax comes asking for Rochester's help in subduing Bertha. Left stunned and alone, Jane sags. Once Bertha's calm, Rochester returns, only to find that Jane's gone. He checks her room and finds the jewels he gave her left behind. He goes to Adele's room, pausing to kiss her forehead, which is nice, and he finds a note Jane left behind, which is only partly readable thanks to the degraded film quality. Desolate, he retires to his study. That's when Mrs. Fairfax hurries in with, of course, the annulment papers. If only Bertha hadn't chosen that unfortunate moment to wander into the room, he and Jane could have gotten married and no one would be the wiser. To Rochester's lament that it's too late, Mrs. Fairfax offers that Jane couldn't have gone very far, and he rushes out to look for her. End scene. As I think I said last time, they've changed the circumstances completely. That Rochester was in the process of getting an annulment puts a different spin on his culpability. Jane's dilemma isn't so bad either, which consequently makes it seem like her departure is kind of an overreaction. In the 1944 version, the scene begins with Jane in her traveling clothes leaving her room, bag in hand. She stops to look in on Adele one last time before heading downstairs, and she might have escaped unnoticed had Rochester not been at the bottom, apparently waiting for her to appear. Disheveled and a bit wild, he immediately begins to explain to her the circumstances of his marriage, how he didn't know Bertha, he was only 19, and it was all prearranged. This monologue is a very fair, condensed version of Rochester's pages-long explanation of his and Bertha's story, bringing it back to his and Jane's meeting. His eyes glowing with the memory, he refers to that first evening when he interrogated her and she responded readily and with a smile as the moment when he knew she was the one he'd been searching for. Jane assures him that she does forgive him and does love him.
I can say it now since it's for the last time.
It's interesting that this portion of dialogue isn't delivered face-to-face. Rather, he's behind her and a few feet away. It's when she finally turns, affirming that to live together would be to hurt themselves, that he comes forward to grasp her arms, but not too tightly and not for too long. He surrenders and lets her go. Their final parting is surprisingly quiet as she stands by the door and offers her benediction, and he remains by the stairs. Wells's Rochester makes no show of histrionics to keep her from going out the door. He does call to her with increasing urgency as she walks away, but it's too late. The 1970 version of the scene has Jane coming down the stairs, back in black, and finding Rochester sitting before the fire. Instead of trying to avoid him, as would be expected, she seems to seek out this conversation. They have unfinished business. She wants to hear what he has to say. His opening remarks are bitter, as if his pain is speaking out. He softens when he tells her why he did it, that he didn't want to lose her, until she says, "You have lost me, and I've lost you." In part because of the actors' respective ages, 31 and 43, this version of the argument has a more mature feeling and a natural feeling that I appreciate. At first he does the talking, but it's not long before Jane makes her case, and there's no yielding with her. The adapted dialogue is different from the book, but I really like this scene. It's one of my favorites in this adaptation. The second he starts to get more aggressive, she says plainly and boldly, "I won't be your mistress." Jane brings up an excellent point that as his companion, she'd have none of the legal rights she'd be entitled to as his wife. That's something practical she needs to consider as a poor young woman with no family to fall back on. He can say that all he has is hers, but that's not secure. She desires nothing but him, but she does want theirs to be an equal union, nothing less. This is the first adaptation to spotlight Jane's need to hold on to her self-respect and her independence, tying what she says here to comments she made earlier in the proposal scene.
When I come to you, Edward, I come to you as an equal. I will not be less. Even for the man I love.
When Rochester scoffs at her comment that Bertha is still living, Jane admirably defends her rights as well. The conversation seems to be ending on a caustic note, Rochester offended by her insinuation that his feelings are not as deep as hers, and he dismisses her. But as she reaches the doorway, he regrets it and begs her to wait. The lovely John Williams theme plays as he returns to the fire and she kneels beside him. He asks her to wait a little while before making her final decision. Gradually, night passes. The next morning, he wakes to find himself alone, and when he searches for her, he learns she's already gone. Yet again, the 1970 version takes an entirely different approach, and no, it isn't the way I ever envisioned the scene, but I really like the way it plays out anyway. Now for the two old BBC miniseries. A close-up on the cast-off wedding gown starts this section in the 1973 version. Jane's internal monologue ponders her past, present, and future, and we briefly cut away to a scene of the vicar parting with esteemed Rochester and his enormous panting dog. In the voiceover, Jane uses a line that's in the book.
I perceived I was sickening from inanition.
I had to replay that multiple times and consult the book to figure out what she'd said, so that's a word I'll have to incorporate into my vocabulary now. Feeling some inanition right now, I haven't had lunch yet. Jane opens her door, and apparently Rochester was standing on the other side because he walks right in. She's faint and nearly collapses against him. She doesn't refuse his embrace, probably doesn't have the strength for it, but then she reaches for him again, of her own will. Her resolve to resist isn't strong yet either. They continue the scene in the library, where they manage to pack everything in about 7 minutes without rushing the dialogue. Jason gets lots of points here. His Rochester is a subtle but believable bundle of constantly shifting emotions. He's hurt, incensed, offended, demanding, horrified by old memories which have never faded. But the focus shifts off of him and back to her when she says she has to leave, especially when she vehemently speaks against becoming his mistress.
I must leave you, Mr. Rochester.
Jane, you must be reasonable, or in truth I shall go mad.
If I were to live with you as you desire, I should then be your mistress, a thing owned by you. And that I will not be, both for my own sake and for yours.
In this version, he doesn't even deny that that's what she would be, and that seems to be all she needs to know, because from that point on, she's trying to get out of the room. His delivery of the go one-way line is much fiercer than what came before. He kisses her intensely to try to change her mind twice, but she firmly stands her ground.
It would not be wicked to love me.
It would be to obey you.
She asks God's blessing on him before rushing out of the room. He follows her, but only so far, shouting after her as she runs up the stairs. We next see her waiting for the coach. The 1983 version begins with Jane in her customary black washing her face, her movements slow and deliberate like one still in shock. Finding her drinking water gone, she goes out to get some, stumbling over Rochester's leg and falling across his lap. It's a bit awkward, but I think it's the closest approximation of what the book describes, at least as I've pictured it. Jane stays very still while he talks, her back to him as she braces against her door. He asks for some sort of heated response, the camera stretching to accommodate them both in the frame, and as she tries to explain that she needs water, she can't hold herself up anymore and swoons. He catches her and carries her down the stairs, poofy dress and all. I bet that was cumbersome. In the library, he gets her the wine, then tries to kiss her after she drinks it, but Jane is making a concerted effort to be cold and resolute. She shrinks from him as if pained, speaks in very low tones, and struggles to maintain a stony expression. Meanwhile, Rochester is animated and changeable, angry, then amorous, having to apologize every time he gets exasperated. When she finally tells him she must leave, which of course he won't accept, she runs out of the room. He chases her into the hall, where the acoustics are such that I'm sure everyone in the house can hear them.
Sir, your wife is still living!
Do not call me married!
He manages to coax her back inside, where he gives further details of his arranged marriage. This being the lengthiest version of Jane Eyre, it comes as no surprise that it's got the longest interpretation of this scene. As such, it can take extra time with a few things and include some bits other adaptations don't, though naturally it's still not word for word. Rochester almost smothers Jane during the "Do you mean it now" section, and when she still won't relent, he's at the end of his tether and loses his composure. For some reason, it's especially noticeable in this version that Jane doesn't say much, but she doesn't say a lot in the book either. Rochester has the brunt of the dialogue, as usual, while Jane keeps most of her thoughts and feelings private, so when she does choose to speak, it's significant. During his mere read in my hand speech, which is trimmed down to a couple lines, he doesn't grip her as tightly, and she easily slips away. The scene closes with Rochester's heartbroken sobs, and Jane does turn back, but she doesn't caress him. She backs away slowly, entreating him not to follow her. As she goes upstairs, they add this dramatic close.
But you will give me your love. You will. You will!
Which might be a bit much. After that, we see Jane put the necklace he gave her on the mantel before going out to meet the coach with her parcel and purse. Switching back to film adaptations means a return to abridged versions of this scene, and the 1996 take on it is especially quick. We see Jane, in the safety of her room, remove her bonnet and its gauzy veil. Cut to Rochester walking down the hall. He encounters Jane as she rounds the corner, now with her cloak and bag, and there's no beating around the bush here. He tells her he loves her and asks her to say the same. She replies,
"I love you more than ever, but this is the last time I shall ever say it. I must leave you."
And that's it. She hurries out to meet the approaching coach. There's actually a lot more to this scene because the screenplay takes the opportunity to advance the climax of the film. Bertha's watching Jane leave from the window and grabs a torch while Grace's back is turned. Jane rushes into the coach as Rochester follows, shouting for her to come back. He grabs a horse and goes riding after her, but he's called back by the fact that, spoiler, his house is on fire. He turns around not to save the house, but to save Bertha, who he sees running around on the roof. Jane is unaware of all of this as she escapes in the coach. Unlike the book and other adaptations, this version gives us a hint of Rochester's fate after Jane leaves. She has no idea, but we have an inkling. Cinematically, this scene is very intense, and it's an interesting way to speed up the latter part of the story when there isn't very much runtime left. My complaint is that it's awfully abrupt, and I'm not sure what exactly motivated Jane to run away here. Was it that Rochester lied? Was it that she's now in a scandalous position? Was it to flee temptation? Or was it to flee the homicidal maniac that's already tried to kill her? I would just like a little more explanation. Next up, 1997. Oh, this scene. Jane somberly lays out her wedding clothes before leaving. As she heads out, she finds Rochester sitting outside her room, and it starts. If you don't like Ciarán Hinds' Rochester in general, you probably hate him the most here. When she passes him, bag in hand, he immediately turns sarcastic, saying her desertion is such a predictable move. She doesn't respond, so he yanks at her arm to make her stop. He accuses her of only being interested in his wealth, as he hurls her bag down the stairs. He likens her to Blanche Ingram and calls her a spoiled, ignorant child before stopping her again. He snarls that he only tried to commit bigamy to make her happy since being married was so important to her. So, if it weren't for that, he would have ruined her by making her his mistress? What a jerk! I hate that they added that line. He dares her to say she doesn't love him. When she won't speak, he drags her out to the tree where they got engaged. Gotta love this. Jane says, "I've always been honest with you," to which he responds, "I've always wanted to be honest with you," as if that's the same thing. Rochester looks a little startled when she does finally say she loves him, but the calm only lasts a moment before he's arguing back, saying, "It's not wrong if we love each other, it's wrong not to be together." One of the only things I like is when he insists he's never changed.
I'm the same as I always was. The same heart, the same mind.
You are a married man!
But I'm still me!
She says she's horrified to think of moments when they were happy together, knowing now that his wife was locked up upstairs the whole time. But the crux of the matter seems to be that Jane's confidence has been betrayed.
I could never trust you again.
She steps closer to him to impress on him how hard this is for her, but she can't throw away her self-respect to succumb to temptation. She begs him to help her fight against it, which is silly because he's clearly not going to be her ally. Here's the other thing I like, when Rochester says, "We'll just go abroad and say you're my wife. We'll know any different."
Me! I will know it. I would have to live with my own conscience, and that would eat away at my soul, till I was no longer Jane Eyre, but some embittered mistress who you resented being with.
She adds that she's leaving for them, to preserve what they had. He rejects that notion, calls her selfish, and sends her off, haranguing her with final words that might have been heartbreaking if they weren't delivered with such rage. I seldom can bring myself to say something as negative as, "I don't like this version of this scene," but I don't like this version of this scene. But I will say this. Ciarán Hinds played Rochester 3 years earlier in a radio adaptation with a different script and under a different director. And from what I've been told, his performance is completely different, much less abrasive. Once this whole project is done, I'm finally going to listen to that radio program and determine that for myself. But I can believe it, because this is the same guy who played Frederick Wentworth after all. In the 2006 version, Jane removes her necklace, a gift from Rochester, as he knocks on her door. He's asking for forgiveness, explaining that he knew she wouldn't stay if he told the truth, and saying that they can go live together somewhere where no one will interfere. In slow motion, she removes each article. And note the contrast. Jane had an overeager attendant that morning, but now she removes the gown and puts it away herself. Restored to her old self, she lays back on the bed, and we fade to black. Then we cut to Jane lying outside on a rock and exposed to the harsh wind. What happened? This version jumps forward in time here. It's not until she's been away with the Rivers that we find out she had a meeting with Rochester before she left. Something St. John says triggers Jane memory of that night, and we cut to a warmly lit, breathy, very hands-on interpretation of Jane and Rochester's conversation. Jane and Rochester lie on her bed, fully clothed, and while she's insisting that she must leave Thornfield, he keeps caressing and kissing her. It's like he's daring her, doing his best to get her all hot and bothered, hoping that something will give. When she continues to resist, he gives up, sort of. Now he brings up his villa idea, and when she protests against that, he says, "Well, hold on, hear me out. We'll pretend we're siblings. We'll be proper. I won't even touch you," which is ridiculous. He couldn't stick to that.
"I wouldn't tempt you into a life of sin, Jane."
Oh, really? And what was that you were doing a minute ago? It cuts away then to an external shot. We hear Jane say she needs to rest and assure him they'll talk more in the morning, but, well, clearly this is morning, and we see her hurrying out, glancing back just once to where Bertha's scarf flaps outside her window. So, the bedroom scene. Opinions are divided on this topic. For some people, it's their favorite scene, but for others, it's the fly in the ointment marring an otherwise faithful adaptation. My feeling toward it is, yeah, it's sexy, but it doesn't feel quite right for Jane Eyre. I don't believe the character, with all her principles, would let a man she wasn't married to, who's married to somebody else, get so handsy. This is the woman whose respect for propriety kept her fiancé at a safe distance during their engagement, and in the aftermath of what's happened, I don't think she'd be so foolish as to put herself in this position where she'll be tempted to the utmost. And honestly, I think less of Rochester for making it so difficult and testing her when she's saying this isn't what she wants. Is it sensual? Yeah, the actors have undeniable chemistry, but I have several objections to it on contextual grounds. It's a pretty short scene overall, since Rochester already gave the Bertha backstory in a previous sequence, and I think I said that I would talk about that flashback in this video, so I'd better do that. After dropping mysterious hints for months, Rochester finally divulges all the facts of his marriage after the wedding party has met his wife. We see Bertha flirting with a longer-haired Rochester and sneaking off to make out with him. We see their marriage ceremony, where Bertha's got a wandering hand. And then there's a quick scene of Rochester finding Bertha in flagrante with some other guy. That's an awkward scene if you're a kid watching this with your parents and you're thinking, there won't be anything sexual in this. It's Jane Eyre. I can tell you from experience. A few weeks later, he says he learned just how uncontrollably violent she was. The last flashback we see shows him sneaking Bertha into Thornfield. She's inclined to dawdle, taking a look up at the moon and the night sky, unaware that it's the last time she'll stand outside and see it. Last one! I'm sorry this has been such a long video. 2011 also shows Jane removing her wedding clothes, but with a sense of urgency, frantically tearing at her stays and struggling to get the whole thing off as quickly as possible. She stops as a tear rolls down her cheek and then takes a moment to catch her breath before putting on her old gown. Given how dark it is, it seems to be very late when Jane emerges from her room. She finds Rochester lying on the floor in the hall. Possibly he'd fallen asleep there. Notice that she's still got her wedding hairdo, which I imagine was too intricate to bother fussing with in her emotional state. He begs her for tears or screams, and she says that she needs some water. I find this bit so relatable. She walks forward and then hesitates and gasps, like she thought she was ready, but she moved too fast and got dizzy. Anticipating that she may faint, he picks her up, and she's a little stunned by that. Downstairs, we focus for half a minute on Rochester lighting the fire, for the aesthetic, I guess. After taking just one sip of wine, she assures him she'll be well again soon. Since she obviously needs more sustenance than that, I feel like she must be trying to put him off. That's certainly her intent when he leans forward to kiss her, and she tilts her head away to avoid it. Rochester gets up, an anguished look on his face. Actually, their expressions are equally strained, and they look especially desperate in this eerie lighting. At the start of the conversation, she's trying to act professional and stay distant, her posture very upright and correct. But she does sway a bit, and her face occasionally twitches, giving away her inner turmoil. Unlike other versions where Jane's pretty much come to terms with her resolution, here the emotions are apparently still raw. The tears Jane didn't show him before begin to flow as he asks her if she still loves him. But her sadness turns to repugnance and disbelief when he asks her to be his wife still. She accuses him of being deceitful, and his repentance is genuine. Not just, I probably shouldn't have done that, but I did a horrible thing. He then tells her about Bertha, an abridged version that hits all the main points, with the added lines that only cruelty would check her and I would not use cruelty. Also, he asks her if she's ever been in a madhouse.
The inmates are caged and baited like beasts. I spared her that, at least.
Thanks to the heightened emotions, Rochester's story is especially compelling, but when he reaches for her, she still forces herself to pull away. He can't bear this and begins pleading with her. She's not unmoved, but she's resilient, saying, "I must respect myself." That's when he really falls apart, delivering the mere read in my hands dialogue, which is much more intense and even threatening here, with his hands around her neck. Yikes! I really like their brief struggle. Well, I don't like it, but I like how it's played, especially on Jane's end. Jane bolts up as soon as Rochester relaxes his grip. He still grabs her waist, though, like he won't let go of her. I've just watched all these, so I should know, but I think this is the only version where Rochester says,
"But whatever I do with this cage, I cannot get at you. And it is your soul that I want."
Jane's been very careful not to touch him, but with one last anxious plea, she breaks free.
God help me.
We then cut to her departure from Thornfield in the early morning hours, which is where the film began. This rendition of the scene is way more intense than not all of the others, but most of them. There's that little yikes moment with Rochester, which I'm sure turned some members of the audience against him, but countering that is Jane's assertiveness, especially when she frees herself by forcing his hands off. I really get what she's feeling in this scene, and that hasn't always been the case for me with this less emotive Jane. This is probably her emotional apex, and so I appreciate that they let loose here in a contextually appropriate way to show what she's going through. So, we found out that 5 versions keep this conversation separate from Jane's departure, 1970, 1973, 1983, 2006, and 2011. 3 have her meet him with bag in hand, 1944, 1996, and 1997, and 1934 doesn't have a conversation at all. Actually, I guess it's 6. 1934 does have the conversation separate from her departure. It just doesn't seem like much of a conversation. Watching the 2011 clip again made me realize how much the tone can vary at the end of the conversation. In 1970 and 2006, she actually gives Rochester to understand that she might stay. If nothing else, she'll still be there in the morning. In 73 and 83, she manages to extricate herself without too much struggle and escape to her room, and in 2011, she has to tear herself from his grasp. It's a very interesting contrast. As I've pointed out a few times now, many versions combine the 2 sections where Rochester talks about his marriage into one monologue, given in the church or in Bertha's chamber. A few versions, most notably 1970, 1997, and 2011, emphasize Jane's self-respect, and while most versions do have a tug-of-war, so to speak, between Rochester's strength and Jane's will, and have him physically attempting to keep her from going, a lot of them do away with the more controversial verbiage, the I could break you, I could bend you, I could crush you, which is understandable. It's not Rochester's best moment, and it might not play well. Speaking for myself, of course, I lean toward the 1973 and 1983 miniseries versions, as usual, but I also find the 1970 and 2011 interpretations really stand out. Okay, I'm done! I apologize for this long video. I just couldn't see myself glossing over some of the material, and I didn't want to break it up into 2 parts. I do hope that you enjoyed it, though, and please feel free to share your thoughts on this particular scene and the adaptations of it in the comments below. I look forward to reading those, and it looks like I'm still on course to finish this series by the end of the year, which I think would be a nice Christmas present, so keep your ear to the ground for the next installment, which should be along in September. As always, thanks for watching.